Ma'am, this section is reserved for premium guests. Are you sure you're in the right seat? That was the sentence that started it all, spoken to a 75-year-old black grandmother who had every right to sit in first class. But because of her skin, her scarf, and her silence, she was treated like a trespasser in her own country. What the airline crew didn't know, her grandson was one of the most powerful lawmakers in America, and he was about to change everything. This isn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about what happens when everyday dignity collides with everyday bias. As Maya Angelou once said, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. If this story makes you feel something, anger, hope, reflection, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. Your voice matters here. It was a crisp autumn morning at Denver International Airport. The terminal buzzed with travelers in sleek suits and designer luggage. No one seemed to notice the small elderly black woman who shuffled quietly past the luxury boutiques and into Gate 43, clutching a tattered leather purse. Her name was Delilah Carter, 75 years old, 5'2", wearing a faded floral dress and a thick brown cardigan with hand-sewn patches. A vintage headscarf covered her silver curls, and on her feet were orthopedic shoes with visible wear. She looked like someone's sweet old church grandmother, not someone you'd expect in first class. As she approached the Sky Eagle Airlines boarding gate, Delilah gently handed her first-class ticket to the gate agent. The young woman scanned it, glanced up briefly, hesitated for just a second, but then forced a smile and waved her through. Delilah nodded politely and made her way down the jet bridge, the quiet click of her heels lost in the chatter around her. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was bathed in soft lighting, the scent of leather and citrus wafting from the freshly cleaned seats. Delilah found her spot, seat 1A by the window, and settled in slowly, placing her purse gently on her lap. She gazed outside at the tarmac, whispering a short prayer just as she had done every time she flew. To her, this trip to Washington, D.C. wasn't just a vacation. It was a deeply personal journey, revisiting the city where she had marched for civil rights 5 decades ago. The moment of peace didn't last. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a voice with a sharp edge. Delilah turned to see a tall, clean-cut flight attendant with blonde hair and a forced grin. His name tag read Brian. Behind him stood another attendant, a woman in her 30s with a tight bun and a clipboard. "Emma." "Yes?" Delilah responded, her voice calm but alert. Brian leaned closer. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Delilah blinked. "Yes. 1A. I triple-checked." Emma tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Do you mind showing your boarding pass again? Just to be safe." Delilah, slightly taken aback, reached into her purse and handed over the folded paper ticket. Brian examined it for a few extra seconds, then exchanged glances with Emma. "Strange," he muttered. "Maybe it was an upgrade error." Emma looked Delilah up and down. "It's just, our first-class section is usually reserved for premium guests." The words landed like a slap. Delilah sat straighter. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am. Not to offend you. It's just that we've had mix-ups before, and this kind of thing, well, it draws attention." By now, a few heads had turned in the cabin. One man in a suit lowered his newspaper. A woman with pearls clutched her bag closer. No one said a word. Delilah took a slow breath. "I paid for this seat. Full price. I booked it 2 months ago." Emma didn't respond, but the tension in her eyes grew. Brian leaned toward a wall phone and whispered something Delilah couldn't hear. Moments later, a third figure arrived. An airline supervisor. The woman bent down, looked Delilah square in the face, and spoke with rehearsed professionalism. "Ma'am, we've had a flag on your boarding status. Could you please come with me for just a moment while we verify a few details?" Delilah's eyes burned, but she held her chin high. "I'm not moving. You can verify right here, in front of everyone." The supervisor hesitated. Ryan stepped in. "We can't begin boarding the rest of first class until this is resolved." "More stairs now," someone coughed awkwardly. A man murmured something under his breath. Delilah's hands gripped the arms of her seat. Then came the final blow. "If you don't comply, we'll have to call security," the supervisor said, lowering her voice as if doing Delilah a favor. The words hit her like a winter wind, not because she was afraid, but because they were so familiar. She'd heard versions of them her whole life. With a sigh, she rose. As she walked slowly down the aisle toward Coach, escorted like a criminal, no one spoke up, not one voice of protest. Her seat now occupied by silence and shame. She took her place in a cramped middle seat in row 29, tears welling but not falling. She wouldn't give them that. What they didn't know, what no one on that plane knew, was that Delilah Carter's grandson was Congressman Jeremiah Carter, one of the most influential young lawmakers in America, and he was waiting for her call. Jeremiah Carter stood alone in his D.C. office, gazing out over the Capitol Mall as the sun began to dip behind the monuments. His schedule was packed with policy briefings and legislative meetings, but something felt off. He hadn't heard from Grandma Delilah since early morning, and she never missed a check-in when flying. He glanced at his phone again. Still no call. Then his assistant Taylor knocked and peeked in. "Congressman, you need to see this." Taylor handed him a phone, already queued up to a viral video spreading across social media. Jeremiah tapped play. The grainy clip, filmed shakily from the back of an airplane, showed a frail elderly woman standing defiantly in first class. Voices murmured in the background. A flight attendant's tone was sharp, dismissive. Then came the chilling words, "If you don't comply, we'll have to call security." Jeremiah's jaw clenched. That voice, it was unmistakably Grandma Delilah's. "I'm not moving," she said firmly in the video. "I paid for this seat, just like anybody else." Seconds later, the clip showed her being escorted down the aisle, clutching her purse, her dignity shattered. Jeremiah didn't say a word. He handed the phone back, picked up his coat, and said only, "Get Sky Eagle Airlines on the line, and tell the press secretary we're making a statement in 30 minutes. The rising action came fast. Within hours, major news outlets had picked up the story. Congressman's grandmother removed from first class due to racial profiling. Hashtags like "Justice for Delilah" and "Fly with Dignity" trended nationwide. Protesters began gathering outside Sky Eagle's headquarters, demanding accountability. But for Jeremiah, this wasn't about politics. It was personal. He flew to Denver that night and met his grandmother at her small apartment in the Five Points neighborhood. She opened the door with a tired smile. "I didn't want to bother you, baby," she said. "You didn't bother me, Grandma." "They did." They sat in silence for a moment before Delilah spoke again. "It wasn't the seat, Jeremiah. It was the way they looked at me. Like I didn't belong. Like I was less." Jeremiah took her hand. "Then let's make sure no one ever feels that way again." The climax came the next morning. Jeremiah called a press conference at the steps of the Capitol. Behind him stood Delilah, her scarf tied neatly, her back straight despite the pain she carried. Dozens of reporters leaned forward as Jeremiah addressed the nation. "My grandmother, Delilah Carter, is a retired schoolteacher. She marched for civil rights in 1963. She raised me with integrity and strength. And yet in 2022, on a flight she paid for with her own money, she was treated like a trespasser because of her skin color and the clothes she wore." He paused, letting the silence hang. This isn't just about one airline. It's about a culture that still sees value based on appearance, and I won't stand for it. Not as a lawmaker and not as a grandson. Delilah stepped forward, her voice soft but unwavering. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for respect. Not just for me, but for every passenger who's ever been made to feel invisible." The nation listened. The footage aired across every major network. Millions watched. Some cheered. Others wept. The falling action began that afternoon, when Sky Eagle Airlines released a rushed, tone-deaf statement, blaming a ticketing error. Public backlash only grew stronger. Then came the turning point. Jeremiah publicly declined any private settlement. Instead, he demanded systemic reform, mandatory anti-bias training for all airline employees, a new federal passenger dignity bill, and an independent review of all past discrimination complaints against the airline. Delilah, meanwhile, received thousands of letters from across the country. Strangers wrote of their own humiliating experiences. Grandmothers, veterans, single moms. She read each one with care, underlining the words that hurt the most. They looked at me like I didn't matter. The resolution arrived, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Delilah sat with Jeremiah one evening on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Tourists wandered nearby, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding. "You know," she said, "when they made me leave that seat, I felt small. But now I know we've turned that pain into purpose." Jeremiah nodded, looking out over the reflecting pool. "You've always had a seat at the table, Grandma. We're just making sure the world sees it too." And as the sun set over Washington, a movement had begun, sparked by one woman's quiet refusal to be dismissed. The boardroom at Sky Eagle Airlines headquarters had never been so tense. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in the cold light of an overcast morning as a dozen executives sat stiffly around the polished oak table. They had gathered expecting a routine, quarterly review. Instead, they were about to face a reckoning. At precisely 9 a.m., the doors opened. Congressman Jeremiah Carter walked in with quiet authority, dressed in a navy suit, his face solemn. Behind him came Delilah Carter, composed, poised, and dressed in the same cardigan and scarf she'd worn during the infamous flight. Her presence turned heads immediately. A few board members exchanged guilty glances. Others looked away entirely. The CEO, a middle-aged white man named Richard Lyle, stood from his seat. "Congressman Carter," he began, "thank you for—" "I'm not here for formalities," Jeremiah cut in calmly, but firmly. "I'm here for the truth." That was the hook, and the tension only mounted from there. Jeremiah pulled out a small folder and placed it on the table. Inside this are 32 complaints filed by passengers of color in the last year. All were quietly closed or marked as resolved. But the patterns are undeniable. He flipped open the folder. An Army veteran with a prosthetic leg forced to prove he had purchased a business-class seat. A black college professor asked to step aside so his ID could be double-checked. A Latina woman in first class interrogated about her accent. And then there's my grandmother, escorted out like a criminal. Murmurs stirred around the table. Richard Lyle's face tightened. "We regret what happened. We issued a formal apology. We're prepared to make amends." Jeremiah's voice dropped a tone. "An apology without accountability is just damage control." Then came the rising action. Delilah stood. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice, though gentle, carried the weight of generations. "I'm not here for pity," she said. "I'm not here to be the face of your diversity campaign. I'm here because something inside this company is broken. And if no one tells you the truth, it will stay broken." She pulled out a folded list from her purse. "These are the names of crew members who laughed, who looked away, who stood by, while I was shamed. Not just on my flight, but on many others." Several names on the board looked visibly uncomfortable. One woman reached for her water glass with a shaky hand. The climax came fast. Jeremiah leaned in, his gaze sweeping the room. "We are not asking, we are demanding change. Starting today, Sky Eagle must institute the following: mandatory anti-bias training developed by independent experts, a zero-tolerance discrimination policy enforced with real consequences, and a public transparency report on all complaints received." He looked directly at Richard Lyle. "And every employee involved in my grandmother's mistreatment will be suspended, retrained and reassigned, not as punishment, but as education." The silence was deafening. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "We'll need time to review these proposals." "You have 48 hours, Jeremiah replied. "After that, we go public with every one of these unresolved cases, national hearings, airline reform legislation, and I assure you, I have the votes." The falling action began with Lyle slowly nodding. realizing there was no escape hatch. "We'll comply," he said. "All of it." Delilah offered him a look, not of forgiveness, but of clarity. "You don't have to like me," she said. "You just have to respect me." The boardroom exhaled. A decision had been made, but the work had only just begun. In the resolution, Jeremiah and Delilah stepped outside into the chilled air. Reporters swarmed the sidewalk, cameras rolling, but Jeremiah raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "My grandmother was dismissed from first class because someone thought she didn't belong. But let me be clear, she belongs wherever she wants to be. And starting today, every passenger will—" Delilah looked into the cameras, her eyes unshaken. "I may be old, but I still remember what it feels like to be invisible. Not anymore." That clip would be played on every major network within the hour. And inside Sky Eagle Airlines, a quiet revolution had begun. 3 weeks had passed since the showdown in the Sky Eagle boardroom, but for Delilah Carter, the wound still lingered. Even as news headlines praised the airline's swift commitment to reform, even as public opinion rallied behind her, Delilah couldn't shake the ache of humiliation. Real change, she knew, didn't come from press conferences or corporate memos. It came from people face to face, heart to heart. One quiet Sunday morning she received an unexpected message. A handwritten letter slid under her apartment door. The return address was local, and the shaky handwriting simply read, "Richard, Sky Eagle Airlines." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Carter, I was one of the flight attendants on your flight. I stood by and said nothing when you were mistreated. I didn't speak up, and I should have. I've since been reassigned to coach and required to undergo full bias training, but none of that matters if I don't say this to you in person. If you'd be willing, I'd like to meet you. Sincerely, Richard O'Hara." Delilah stared at the letter for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the number scribbled at the bottom. The rising action took place a few days later, inside a modest diner tucked between a laundromat and a barber shop in East Denver. Delilah sat at a corner booth, sipping hot tea, and the door jingled open. Richard walked in, his uniform replaced with jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked smaller than he did on the plane, not in size, but in presence. He spotted her, offered a hesitant wave, and approached the booth. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "thank you for agreeing to meet me." Delilah gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit. I don't have all day." Richard managed a nervous smile and slid into the booth. "I won't pretend I didn't fail you," he began. "I did. I saw the way they treated you. I could have said something, but I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to lose my job." Delilah raised her eyebrows. "And now, I realize I already lost something more important," he said. "My self-respect." The diner buzzed softly around them, clinking dishes, low conversation. But in that booth, the air was heavy with something deeper than apology. The climax came when Richard leaned forward and said, "Since I was transferred to economy class, I've been listening, really listening, to the way some of us talk about passengers, the assumptions we make, the jokes we whisper in the galley. You opened my eyes, Mrs. Carter, and I'm sorry it took your pain to do that." Delilah didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, "You know what hurt the most? It wasn't the seat. It wasn't even the silence. It was the look on your face, like I didn't belong, like I was a problem, not a person." "I know," Richard replied, his voice cracking, "and I'll carry that shame with me for the rest of my life." The falling action arrived when Delilah reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folded photograph. She placed it on the table. It was a black and white image, young Delilah in her 20s, marching with other civil rights protesters in Selma. "I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen," she said. "I didn't ask to be the face of anything, but maybe this moment, this discomfort, maybe it's worth something if it means people like you don't make the same mistake twice." Richard's eyes welled. "It is. I promise you, it is." The resolution came not in fireworks, but in a quiet understanding. They finished their tea. As they stood to leave, Richard hesitated before extending his hand. Delilah shook it firmly. "This isn't forgiveness," she said. "It's responsibility. Keep carrying it." "I will," he said. Outside, the clouds had cleared, and the Colorado sun broke through. As Delilah walked home, her steps felt lighter than they had in weeks. Real change had begun, not just in policy, but in people. And that, she thought, is where the real work lives. 6 months later, Delilah Carter stepped onto another Sky Eagle Airlines flight. This time, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't shrinking into herself or scanning the cabin for judgmental stares. She moved with quiet confidence, her worn brown cardigan draped over her shoulders like armor. The gate agent had greeted her with a warm smile. The flight crew had addressed her respectfully. No one questioned her presence in first class. She eased into seat 1A, the same seat where everything had started. But today, the energy was different. That was the hook. As the plane began boarding, Delilah looked out the window and reflected on how far things had come. Following the press storm and public outcry, Sky Eagle had launched one of the most comprehensive employee reform programs in airline history. Their Passenger Dignity Initiative wasn't just a PR move, it had teeth. Independent bias training was now required quarterly. A new code of conduct emphasized accountability and empathy. And perhaps most symbolically, the airline had appointed Delilah as their official cultural advisor. She didn't seek the title, but she accepted it for the people who never had a voice. The rising action continued. As passengers filed into the cabin, a middle-aged white man in a business suit took the seat beside her. He glanced over and offered a kind smile. "Flying for work or fun?" he asked politely. "Neither," Delilah replied, her voice calm. "I'm flying for change." The man looked intrigued, but didn't pry. That was already progress. Then, just before takeoff, a familiar face stepped into the aisle. Richard O'Hara, the flight attendant from that day, now in a modest gray uniform, pushing a service cart with quiet focus. He spotted Delilah, paused, and offered a nod that was both respectful and full of gratitude. Delilah nodded back. No words needed. That was enough. The climax arrived mid-flight. As the plane cruised 36,000 feet above the country she had spent her life trying to improve, Delilah was asked to speak over the cabin PA system. It was a surprise, arranged by the flight crew. The captain, a black woman named Captain Brooks, approached her seat and said, "Mrs. Carter, would you be willing to say a few words? There are people here who need to hear your story." Delilah hesitated, then slowly stood. She walked to the front of the cabin, took the small handset in her hand and with a steady voice said, "Good afternoon, folks. I know I'm not part of your scheduled entertainment, but I was once removed from this very seat, not because of a mistake, but because of a judgment made in a heartbeat, a judgment about who I was and whether I belonged." The cabin was silent. "But I'm still here, not to shame anyone, but to remind all of us that the cost of silence is far greater than the discomfort of speaking up. You don't have to change the whole world. Just start by changing how you see it." The falling action came after she returned to her seat. The young Latina woman from the back of the plane came forward, softly asking if she could shake Delilah's hand. "My mother's been through so much of what you described," she said through tears. "Thank you for not staying quiet." A few passengers applauded. Others offered silent nods or placed hands over their hearts. No grand gestures, just quiet, human connection. By the time the wheels touched down at Reagan National Airport, something unspoken had shifted in that cabin, not because of one woman's pain, but because of her courage. The resolution came days later. Delilah was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on transportation and civil rights. Her words, clear, unscripted, and deeply honest, sparked a nationwide movement. Airlines across the country began adopting similar reforms. Industry leaders called for a cultural reset in customer service and equity training. And more importantly, passengers, regardless of age, background, or color, felt seen in places where they'd once been invisible. Delilah returned home to her quiet Denver neighborhood, where neighbors greeted her with hugs, fresh flowers, and homemade pies. She wasn't just a symbol now, she was a story, a lived reminder that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right. That evening, she sat on her front porch. As the sun dipped behind the Rockies, she sipped sweet tea, wrapped in the same cardigan from that day on the plane, and smiled. Because this time, the journey had ended where it always should have begun, with respect. In the story of Delilah Carter, we're reminded that true dignity isn't something granted by a uniform or a ticket. It's something we're all born with. When she said, "You don't have to change the whole world, just start by changing how you see it," she wasn't just speaking to a cabin full of passengers. She was speaking to all of us. Like Dr. King once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Discrimination often wears a smile and hides behind policies, but silence is its loudest ally. This story is more than about an airline. It's about everyday courage, the kind we each carry. If Delilah's journey moved you even a little, let's keep the conversation going. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and hit that subscribe button, not just for more stories, but to be part of a community that believes in equity, empathy, and standing up when it matters most. We're in this together.